5:17 local time. The first sign of trouble did not come from the bridge. It came from deep inside the destroyer's Combat Information Center, where the sonar display shifted for less than a second, yet changed everything. A low, uneven transient moved across the screen. Then another, then a third. The operator leaned in, eyes locked on the narrow band lines as the sound began to separate from the ocean's background noise. He said nothing at first. He checked the bearing drift. He checked for consistency. He checked whether the signal repeated on the second set. It did. Sonar. Possible submerged contact. The words were steady. Their impact was immediate. Around him, the room did not erupt. It tightened. Heads turned. Pens froze. The tactical action officer stepped up behind the console. On the main display, 3 faint symbols started to take shape against the carrier strike group's track. One sat off the port side, another lingered to starboard and aft. The third was farther ahead, deeper along the carrier's projected path. For a few seconds, no one rushed to define them. In open water, the worst choices often begin with quick assumptions. Then the second operator confirmed another acoustic line. A screw pattern, too controlled to belong to civilian traffic, too deliberate to be random machinery. Another bearing arrived from a separate ship in the screen, and the geometry began to close. 3 distinct returns, all submerged, all moving closer. At 5:18, the report reached the bridge. The destroyer's captain listened without any visible reaction. Ahead of him, the carrier continued through the dim blue-gray water as though nothing had changed. Its wake spread broad and white behind it. Deck lights still glowed in the early morning gloom. From a distance, the formation looked normal. Inside the screen, it no longer was. Pass it to the force commander. Hold course for now. The decision was deliberate. A sudden turn by the carrier could confirm detection to anyone listening below. So, for a few more moments, the strike group kept the appearance of routine movement, while the ships around it began making adjustments so subtle they were nearly impossible to spot. Nearly. The outer escorts altered heading by degrees, not enough to concern anyone watching from the horizon, but enough to start tightening the water around the carrier into a denser anti-submarine envelope. One cruiser edged slightly forward. A destroyer widened off the port quarter. Another ship aft shifted position to improve overlap in acoustic coverage. Below the surface, the geometry was changing. At 5:19, the sonar team got what they needed. A narrow band trace held steady just long enough to remove any doubt. The nearest contact was not drifting. It was maneuvering with purpose. Probable submarine contact bearing 094. No one in CIC looked away from the screen now. A second report came in from another escort. The starboard-aft contact had also reduced range. The forward contact remained the most dangerous of the 3, not because it was the closest, but because it sat near the path the carrier would soon enter if nothing changed. For the first time, the tactical picture suggested intent, not one submarine observing from a distance. 3. At 5:20, flight deck crews aboard the carrier and one of the escorts were already in motion. A Seahawk helicopter sat secured beneath the pale wash of deck lighting, its rotors beginning to unlock as deck crews in colored jerseys moved low and fast around it. There was no shouted panic, no wasted movement, only the speed that comes from repetition. On the destroyer's bridge, the captain watched the carrier through the forward glass, then turned back to the tactical repeater. Keep her steady. Launch the helo. Far below, the sonar picture pulsed again. The port side contact shifted bearing by a fraction, but it was enough to raise a new concern. The submarine was not simply matching the formation, it was angling inward. In CIC, grease pencils moved quickly across the plotting surface. Estimated range circles tightened around the strike group. Projected tracks were drawn, erased, and drawn again. At the console, the officer now had the first clear outline of the problem. 3 underwater contacts approaching from different sectors, forcing the carrier group to think in layers instead of lines. One could be a decoy, one could be screening for another, or all 3 could be working together to squeeze the carrier's maneuvering space before anyone ever saw a wake. At 5:21, the first sonobuoys were approved. A helicopter would investigate from above, but the escorts would begin building their own picture outward from the sea. The pattern was chosen quickly. Not too heavy, not too soon, just enough to test the water without revealing the full response. The carrier itself still had not made a dramatic move. That restraint made the situation more tense, not less. Now everything depended on the screen. The destroyers and cruiser had to detect first, identify first, and shape the encounter before the largest ship in the formation had to reveal that anything was wrong. Then the sonar operator paused for half a beat and leaned into his headset. The port side contact had increased speed, not by much. Just enough. But in undersea tracking, small changes at the right moment said a great deal. The updated vector cut across the formation more sharply than before. The projected line no longer looked like simple observation. It looked like an approach. The tactical action officer studied the track, then the carrier's path. If the contact stayed on that heading, it would move into a far more critical position within minutes. On the flight deck, the Seahawk's rotors had become a blur. Chains were released. Hands flashed signals through the wash of spinning blades. Salt spray whipped across the edge of the deck. Inside CIC, the room stayed cold and precise. 3 submerged contacts, a tightening pattern of bearings, and one submarine, now moving faster than the others, angling directly toward the water the carrier was about to enter. At 5:22, the captain gave the order to tighten the screen. The first phase was over. Now the search was fully underway. At 5:23 local time, the Seahawk lifted clear of the deck and dropped low over the dark water, its rotors pounding the morning air as it accelerated away from the carrier screen. From the outside, the strike group still appeared steady. The carrier held course just long enough to avoid signaling alarm. Inside the formation, every ship had already shifted into a tighter, sharper pattern. The destroyer on the port side moved first. Not a hard turn, not a dramatic break, just enough rudder to widen its angle and push sonar coverage deeper into the sector where the nearest contact had begun cutting inward. Another escort on the starboard quarter adjusted in parallel, closing a gap no one on the open sea would have noticed, but one that mattered below the surface. Inside the destroyer's CIC, the acoustic picture grew denser with every passing second. The first contact remained the most assertive. Its bearing change was steady now, not random. The second contact aft to starboard was also reducing range, though more slowly, staying just outside the clearest part of the screen. The third contact ahead remained the biggest unknown of all, still sitting in front of the carrier's projected track, deep enough and quiet enough to stay dangerous precisely because it had not yet shown its intent. At 5:24, the Seahawk reached the first drop point. The helicopter flared just above the surface and began laying sonobuoys in a fast, disciplined sequence. One, then another, then a third, spaced to form the beginning of a listening line across the port side approach. Each splash placed another sensor in the water. Each new buoy sent more data back into the tactical net. Buoys in the water. No one reacted with excitement. Excitement was useless here. What mattered was correlation. A second destroyer reported a brief transient from the starboard aft sector. Not enough to classify. Enough to confirm something was there. The tactical action officer marked the report and looked again at the wider plot. The 3 contacts were not drifting together by chance. Their spacing suggested awareness of one another. Whether that meant direct coordination or simply disciplined shadowing, the effect on the carrier group was the same. Pressure from 3 directions. At 5:25, the first active return came back weak and incomplete. A flash of shape, then nothing. The contact had slipped beneath a changing layer in the water column, using temperature and depth to bend sound and blur the picture. For a moment, the best track on the portside submarine began to degrade. That was the most dangerous point of the morning so far. Losing a contact did not mean the threat had disappeared. It meant the threat was moving without being clearly seen. CIC remained quiet, but the tension changed. Operators leaned closer, headsets pressed tighter. Grease pencil marks began to crowd the plot as estimates replaced certainty for a few seconds longer than anyone wanted. Contact faded, last known bearing 091. The destroyer's captain heard it on the bridge and showed no outward reaction. He understood the equation. A submarine that had just started pressing inward had now vanished into the water at exactly the point where the screen needed clarity most. At 5:26, the response expanded. A second helicopter crew was ordered to stand by for launch. Farther out, a P-8A Poseidon, already on patrol, was redirected toward the formation. Its role was not to finish the encounter. Its role was to close the gaps, extend the listening range, and give the strike group another layer of eyes and ears across the sea. Inside CIC, one acoustic analyst stayed focused on the lost portside track, filtering the noise through a narrower band. Then he found it, a brief burst of cavitation. Small, rough, imperfect. Just a scrape of sound, the kind made when a submarine changes speed or depth too quickly and leaves a trace in the water. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough. Possible regain, same sector. The updated line appeared slightly offset from the last known position. The submarine had not pulled back. It had gone deeper, changed its angle, and kept moving forward. That changed the mood at once. Now they knew the portside contact was acting with purpose. At 5:27, the carrier made its first meaningful adjustment. Small enough to look unreadable from a distance, but significant enough to matter to any solution being built below the surface. Its course shifted by a few degrees. Its speed changed just enough to bend the geometry away from the original track. The goal was not to flee. The goal was to break someone's calculation. As the carrier moved, the screen moved with it. One destroyer pushed farther out to keep pressure on the port side contact. Another tightened aft to deny the starboard submarine a cleaner approach from behind. Overhead, the Seahawk turned back across its buoy field and prepared for another dip. Then another report arrived. For the first time, the forward contact sharpened. It was not a full profile. It was not a clean classification. But there was now enough acoustic structure to show one critical fact. The submarine ahead was neither stationary nor drifting across the lane. It was adjusting to the carrier's new path. It had reacted. At 5:29, the tactical plot stopped looking like three separate dangers and began to look like a single underwater pattern taking shape. Port side pressing inward, starboard quarter lingering in place. Forward contact repositioning to stay relevant after the carrier's movement. In other words, the strike group was no longer simply under observation, it was being measured. The Seahawk lowered its dipping sonar. The cable streamed down into the cold morning sea while the aircraft hovered in a controlled shudder above the surface. In CIC, every operator waited for the next return. When it came, it was clean enough to silence the room. A hard, narrow acoustic trace, metal moving with discipline. One analyst spoke without taking his eyes off the display. Profile is consistent with a Russian submarine. No one said anything more. No one had to, because almost at the same moment, another call came in from the starboard side of the formation. The aft contact had closed faster than expected. And now, for the first time that morning, one of the destroyers reported a submarine close enough to be treated as an immediate threat. At 5:32 local time, that starboard quarter report changed the tempo across the entire strike group. Up to that point, the formation had been tightening against a growing danger below the surface. Now one submarine had moved into a different category. It was no longer just part of the wider picture. It was too close, too well placed, and moving too deliberately to be treated as background pressure. Inside the destroyer's Combat Information Center, the tactical display updated again as the starboard contact's projected path bent tighter toward the carrier's rear quarter. The geometry had become serious enough to force a choice. The force could no longer spread its attention evenly across all three sectors. One submarine had just made itself the priority. Shift focus starboard. Hold pressure port. Do not lose the forward track. The order moved through the net at once. At 5:33, the first Seahawk came out of its turn and accelerated toward the starboard sector, skimming low over the dark sea with its dipping sonar already set for another cycle. The helicopter crew faced the same challenge as the operators in CIC. They were hunting a submarine that understood the water, understood the screen, and was using both to its advantage. Below, the contact's acoustic pattern sharpened for a few seconds. Not loud, not careless, but clear enough. One analyst isolated the screw rhythm, counted the pulse spacing, and marked the change in propulsion signature. The submarine had adjusted speed deliberately, likely trying to reposition inside the shifting layers while preserving a useful approach angle. It was not breaking away, it was working. Starboard contact maneuvering. That report mattered because the carrier had already made one quiet course change. If the submarine was still adjusting with the formation, then it had not been thrown off. It was reading the movement and matching it. At 5:34, the Seahawk reached the sector and settled into a hover. The sea beneath it frothed white as the dipping sonar cable ran down into the water. On the destroyer's displays, the acoustic net widened, shipboard sonar blending with buoy feeds and airborne data into a denser tactical picture. For several long seconds, nothing returned clearly. Then the signal hit, hard. A tight acoustic trace flared across the display, stronger than any starboard return they had seen that morning. The submarine was there, deeper than the first estimates had suggested, cutting just beneath the most useful part of the screen. Contact regained. Strong return. The tactical action officer stepped closer, his eyes shifting from the starboard plot to the carrier's track line. The range had fallen again. A destroyer on the carrier's right flank was ordered farther out. Not at full sprint, not recklessly, but fast enough to make the submarine think about the hunter instead of the target. The move was calculated. Push too hard and the submarine might slip beneath the layer again. Push too gently and it might keep sliding into position. At 5:35, the submarine reacted. Its bearing changed sharply, its depth shifted. And then, for one brief and unmistakable instant, the acoustic picture cracked with the rough scrape of cavitation. It was exactly the kind of sound submarine crews try to avoid. Short, harsh, mechanical. The cost of maneuvering too aggressively under pressure. In CIC, that tiny burst of noise landed like confirmation. The submarine knew it had been found, but what came next was even more dangerous. Instead of opening the range, the starboard contact cut even closer before dropping deeper, using the maneuver as both protection and opportunity. For several tense seconds, it looked like a boat willing to take one last risk before losing the carrier's geometry. On the bridge, the destroyer's captain listened to the updated track, then gave the order to increase pressure with active sonar bursts. Not continuous, not blind. Short, controlled pulses. Each ping cut into the water and returned with a sharper edge on the submarine's position. The goal was not to signal alarm. The goal was to tell the contact in the clearest language possible below the surface that its cover was disappearing fast. At 5:36, the first starboard submarine began maneuvering defensively. To anyone outside the tactical loop, the change would have looked minor. To the men inside CIC, it was obvious. The boat was no longer shaping its approach first and concealment second. Now it was balancing survival against mission. That meant the screen was beginning to win the exchange, but not all of it. Because while the starboard boat absorbed attention, another report arrived from the opposite side of the formation. The port side contact, the one that had cut inward earlier and then dipped away, had not vanished. It was still there, still being held by the outer screen, and still close enough to matter. The problem was no longer one submarine getting too close. It was one submarine under pressure, while two others waited for the right opening. At 5:37, the P-8A overhead fed fresh data into the network. The forward contact, quiet for too long, had shifted again. Not toward open water, not away from the group. It had moved in relation to the carrier's new track, preserving its relevance while the starboard submarine drew the most immediate response. The realization moved through CIC in seconds. This was not a random three-boat presence. Whether formally coordinated or simply carried out with shared discipline, the pressure was layered. One boat closing hard, one lingering just outside the clearest picture. One ahead, patient and dangerous. The destroyer captain did not waste time on interpretation. Maintain starboard prosecution, keep the carrier clear, lock the port contact, update the forward track now. Above the sea, the Seahawk banked hard across the sector, rotor wash flattening the water below. Another line of buoys was dropped farther out to block the submarine's most useful escape route. The logic was simple. If the contact wanted to keep pressing, it would have to get louder. If it wanted to stay quiet, it would have to give up position. At 5:38, the starboard submarine did exactly what that pressure was meant to force. It turned. Not a full withdrawal, not yet. But its nose shifted just enough to show that the boat was beginning to choose space over angle. For the first time that morning, one of the three underwater blades had been pushed off the cleanest line toward the carrier. And that was when the next report landed. Another contact, starboard quarter, deeper, closing faster than expected. At 5:40 local time, the fourth contact report did not mean a new submarine had entered the scene. It meant the picture on the starboard side had split. One Russian boat had already been forced into defensive maneuvering. Now the deeper return showed how close the strike group had come to losing the shape of a second threat in the same sector. For several seconds, the tactical display looked less like a controlled search and more like a knife fight in the dark, with tracks crossing, fading, and reappearing inside a tightening ring of sonobuoys and shipboard sonar. Inside the destroyer's combat information center, no one raised their voice. Sort the tracks. That became the first priority. Not emotion, not noise, separation. At 5:41, the acoustic team split the starboard picture into two likely tracks. The shallower contact was the submarine already under pressure, the one that had cavitated while turning too hard beneath the screen. The deeper line was cleaner, colder, and far less cooperative. It had stayed low, stayed quiet, and used the confusion above it to keep advancing. That made it the more dangerous submarine now. The Seahawk that had been working the first starboard boat was redirected slightly, just enough to widen its dipping sonar pattern without giving up the original track. At the same time, the second helicopter lifted from the deck and drove low into the morning haze, rotors thundering over the water as it headed toward the carrier's right rear quarter. The strike group was no longer simply reacting. It was starting to shape the water. At 5:42, the carrier made another controlled course change. Again, nothing dramatic, no sudden evasive swing, no obvious break in formation that would signal alarm to anyone watching from a distance. The ship simply bent its path by a few more degrees while keeping its speed disciplined. Around it, the escorts adjusted with practiced precision, opening one lane, narrowing another, forcing every submarine below to recalculate in real time. That was the trap. The carrier moved just enough to alter the geometry. The screen moved just enough to deny the clearest approach lines. And overhead, the helicopters began laying fresh sonobuoys, not where the submarines had been, but across the water they would most likely need next. The first starboard submarine reacted almost at once. It shifted again, trying to recover a cleaner angle as the formation bent away. But that move cost it. A destroyer on the outer edge of the screen caught another brief cavitation burst, followed by an active return sharp enough to hold. Starboard 1 is pressured. The words were flat, but they changed the entire board. That first submarine was no longer the hunter in that sector. It was becoming the contact most at risk of being fixed and tracked. At 5:43, the second starboard boat remained the real problem. Its acoustic signature was weak, intermittent, and disciplined. It had used depth and water conditions better than the others, staying beneath the worst of the active search, while slowly sliding into position behind the formation. It was not rushing. It did not need to. A patient submarine in the right place was more dangerous than a fast one in the wrong place. The P-8A overhead sent another update through the network. The deeper starboard contact had not stopped. It was angling behind the group, likely searching for a sternside solution, while the escorts were still weighted toward the more obvious threat. The response came immediately. One destroyer aft was ordered to turn farther out and north, cutting across the submarine's most useful path. Another escort held centerline coverage to make sure the carrier's wake did not become a blind opening. Above them, the second Seahawk dropped its first buoy line in a shallow arc, building a barrier rather than a chase pattern. That was when the water began to close. At 5:44, the deeper starboard submarine found itself squeezed by three problems at once. The carrier's altered course, a destroyer sliding into its lane, and new buoys turning open water into monitored water. To stay quiet, it had to remain deep and accept worse geometry. To recover position, it had to move harder and risk being heard. It chose movement. The return came back faint at first, then stronger. A narrow streak of disciplined machinery, no longer lost in open water, but traced inside a shrinking box. Regain on starboard, deep contact. For the first time that morning, both starboard submarines were being tracked at the same time. Inside CIC, the tactical action officer did not celebrate. He looked left because the portside submarine was still there, still held by the outer screen, still dangerous, still close enough that the force could not afford to collapse entirely onto the starboard side. That had been the Russian advantage from the start. Three submarines did not need to move together to create pressure. They only had to remain credible in three different places long enough to overload the screen. But by 5:45, that pressure was beginning to turn. The first starboard submarine, the one already exposed, took the worst of it. Another short active pulse cut through the water. The return came back clean enough to show a turn away from the carrier's most dangerous quarter. Not a full withdrawal, but no longer a clean line toward the target. Seconds later, the deeper starboard submarine shifted as well. The change was smaller, harder to catch, but the acoustic team saw it. The nose had moved. The track was bending outward, not inward. The trap was starting to work. At 5:46, the carrier strike group did what train formations do best under pressure. It kept tightening the pressure without going too far. No ship broke formation in a reckless move. No aircraft rushed blindly into empty water. The escorts held overlapping coverage. The helicopters kept their spacing. The carrier stayed on its adjusted path, turning every passing second into a worse solution for anything below the surface. Then the P-8A passed down the most important update of the morning. The forward submarine, the quiet contact that had remained ahead of the formation for nearly the entire encounter, had finally reacted to the new geometry. It was no longer waiting along the carrier's projected route. It was descending and turning away, trying to preserve distance as the rest of the underwater picture began to unravel around it. That meant the pressure from three sides had broken. At 5:47, the first starboard submarine accelerated, not toward the carrier, away from it. This time, the cavitation was unmistakable, a rough, heavy burst of noise that cut through the acoustic picture and told every operator in CIC the same thing at once. The submarine was no longer trying to remain hidden in a usable position. It was trying to get clear. The deeper starboard contact followed seconds later, increasing speed just enough to widen the range from the destroyer crossing its path. Even the portside contact, still not fully exposed, began easing off the inward line it had held since the opening phase. Three submarines had approached from different sectors. Now all three were being forced to think about separation instead of pressure. At 5:48, the tactical display looked different for the first time all morning. The lines were no longer closing. They were opening. The destroyer captain watched the update appear, then gave the order to continue the pursuit, maintain the screen, and deny every path back toward the carrier. No one in CIC relaxed. Not yet. One contact was still deeper than the others, still partially obscured, still moving just enough to remain dangerous. But the balance had shifted. The underwater trap had failed to take shape, and the last submarine was now running short of water, time, and silence. At 5:49 local time, the tactical picture no longer showed three submarines tightening around a carrier. It showed three submarines trying to stay ahead of a screen that had closed around them first. Inside the destroyer's combat information center, the display had changed by degrees rather than spectacle. That was how underwater encounters usually turned, not through drama, but through geometry. Bearings that had been narrowing for more than half an hour were now beginning to spread apart. Attack lanes were becoming exit lanes, but the strike group did not reduce pressure. Not yet. Maintain prosecution. Keep the carrier clear. The order moved cleanly through the formation. At 5:50, the first starboard submarine, the one that had cavitated while trying to hold position beneath the screen, widened range again. This time, there was no uncertainty in its movement. The contact was no longer preserving a useful approach line. It was pulling away toward deeper water, trading noise and distance for room to breathe. A destroyer on the right flank kept just enough pressure on it to prevent any return toward the formation. Overhead, the first Seahawk stayed on station, crossing above the contact's retreat path at low altitude and dropping additional buoys when needed to keep the track from fading into uncertainty. The goal was not destruction. The goal was denial. And below the surface, that denial was working. At 5:51, the deeper starboard submarine tried one last disciplined adjustment. It dipped, shifted bearing, and attempted to use the changing layer beneath the formation to slip behind the escort crossing its path. For a few seconds, the acoustic line weakened. No one in CIC mistook that for safety. The analysts had already seen too much of its behavior. It had stayed patient for too long, and now it had too little room left. A moment later, one buoy line picked it up again, then another. An aft destroyer confirmed the regain with a brief active pulse. The track reappeared farther out, not closer. That was enough. Starboard deep contact opening range. The tactical action officer marked it without expression. Two submarines on the right side had now been pushed off their best geometry. One was already withdrawing noisily. The other was still trying to remain controlled, but it was moving away all the same. At 5:52, attention shifted forward. It kept tightening the pressure without going too far. No ship broke formation in a reckless move. No aircraft rushed blindly into empty water. The escorts held overlapping coverage. The helicopters kept their spacing. The carrier stayed on its adjusted path, turning every passing second into a worse solution for anything below the surface. Then the P-8A passed down the most important update of the morning. The forward submarine, the quiet contact that had remained ahead of the formation for nearly the entire encounter, had finally reacted to the new geometry. It was no longer waiting along the carrier's projected route. It was descending and turning away, trying to preserve distance as the rest of the underwater picture began to unravel around it. That meant the pressure from three sides had broken. At 5:47, the first starboard submarine accelerated, not toward the carrier, away from it. This time, the cavitation was unmistakable, a rough, heavy burst of noise that cut through the acoustic picture and told every operator in CIC the same thing at once. The submarine was no longer trying to remain hidden in a usable position. It was trying to get clear. The deeper starboard contact followed seconds later, increasing speed just enough to widen the range from the destroyer crossing its path. Even the port side contact, still not fully exposed, began easing off the inward line it had held since the opening phase. Three submarines had approached from different sectors. Now all three were being forced to think about separation instead of pressure. At 5:48, the tactical display looked different for the first time all morning. The lines were no longer closing, they were opening. The destroyer captain watched the update appear, then gave the order to continue the pursuit, maintain the screen, and deny every path back toward the carrier. No one in CIC relaxed. Not yet. One contact was still deeper than the others, still partially obscured, still moving just enough to remain dangerous. But the balance had shifted. The underwater trap had failed to take shape, and the last submarine was now running short of water, time, and silence. At 5:49 local time, the tactical picture no longer showed three submarines tightening around a carrier. It showed three submarines trying to stay ahead of a screen that had closed around them first. Inside the destroyer's Combat Information Center, the display had changed by degrees rather than spectacle. That was how underwater encounters usually turned, not through drama, but through geometry. Bearings that had been narrowing for more than half an hour were now beginning to spread apart. Attack lanes were becoming exit lanes, but the strike group did not reduce pressure. Not yet. Maintain prosecution. Keep the carrier clear. The order moved cleanly through the formation. At 5:50, the first starboard submarine, the one that had cavitated while trying to hold position beneath the screen, widened range again. This time there was no uncertainty in its movement. The contact was no longer preserving a useful approach line. It was pulling away toward deeper water, trading noise and distance for room to breathe. A destroyer on the right flank kept just enough pressure on it to prevent any return toward the formation. Overhead, the first Seahawk stayed on station, crossing above the contact's retreat path at low altitude and dropping additional buoys when needed to keep the track from fading into uncertainty. The goal was not destruction. The goal was denial. And below the surface, that denial was working. At 5:51, the deeper starboard submarine tried one last disciplined adjustment. It dipped, shifted bearing, and attempted to use the changing layer beneath the formation to slip behind the escort crossing its path. For a few seconds, the acoustic line weakened. No one in CIC mistook that for safety. The analysts had already seen too much of its behavior. It had stayed patient for too long, and now it had too little room left. A moment later, one buoy line picked it up again, then another. An aft destroyer confirmed the regain with a brief active pulse. The track reappeared farther out. Not closer. That was enough. Starboard deep contact opening range. The tactical action officer marked it without expression. Two submarines on the right side had now been pushed off their best geometry. One was already withdrawing noisily, the other was still trying to remain controlled, but it was moving away all the same. At 5:52, attention shifted forward. It had been the quietest of the three, the most patient, and in some ways the most dangerous because it had revealed the least. While the starboard contacts drew attention and pressure, the forward submarine had been waiting for timing. But the timing was gone. The carrier's second course change had shifted the geometry beneath it. The escorts had filled the most likely approach corridor with overlapping coverage. The P-8A and the helicopter screen had stripped away too much uncertainty. Holding position ahead of the formation no longer offered an advantage. It offered exposure. At 5:53, the forward contact made its first decisive move. It dropped deeper. Then it turned away from the carrier's projected path. On the display, the change looked small, almost understated after the tension of the previous half hour, but everyone in CIC understood what it meant. The submarine was giving up the most dangerous water it had occupied all morning. No one celebrated. They kept building the picture. A cruiser ahead of the carrier tightened its sensor posture. A destroyer on the port side held the outer barrier, making sure the left flank submarine could not use the forward boat's withdrawal to make one final inward move. Overhead, the second Seahawk kept its distance and kept the buoy field alive. The cold sea below was now crowded with listening points that had not existed 30 minutes earlier. At 5:54, the portside submarine made its decision. It had been the first to cut inward that morning, the first to raise serious concern, the first to suggest that the strike group was not simply being observed, but pressured. Now, with both starboard contacts moving off and the forward boat turning away, it faced a choice: hold a losing angle alone or disengage with the others. The answer came in the sound: a rough mechanical wash, brief, unmistakable cavitation. Then the bearing began to open. The submarine was leaving. Port contact opening range. That was the line the room had been waiting for, though no one allowed it to sound like triumph. Not because the danger had vanished, but because professional crews did not mistake withdrawal for safety. A submarine moving away was still a submarine. Until it widened the distance far enough and held it long enough, it remained part of the problem. At 5:55, for the first time that morning, all three Russian contacts were separating from the carrier strike group at once. One to starboard, louder than before. One deeper and farther aft, still disciplined but losing usefulness with every passing minute. One ahead and off-axis, abandoning the path it had worked so carefully to preserve. Three boats had approached from three different sectors. None of them reached a clean firing position. Inside CIC, the pressure did not disappear. It thinned. Shoulders lowered by barely an inch. Hands kept moving with the same discipline as before. But the sharpest edge in the room began to ease. Plotters updated ranges. Sonar operators held their lines. Time marks were entered. Bearings were logged. Every maneuver, every regain, every cavitation burst was added to the record. Because that was what remained after an encounter like this. Not wreckage, evidence. At 5:56, the carrier continued on its revised course. On the surface, it looked almost untouched by the underwater contest that had unfolded around it. Its massive hull still moved steadily through the cold blue water. Its wake still streamed bright and white behind it. From far enough away, no one would have guessed that for nearly 40 minutes, three submarines had tried to reshape the sea around it. Below the surface, the answer had already been written. The strike group detected first, classified fast enough, shifted just enough, and denied every firing solution that mattered. At 5:57, the destroyer captain looked once more at the tactical repeater as the three tracks continued to widen. No dramatic order followed, no triumphant speech, only the next instruction. Continue to monitor. Maintain screen integrity. Nothing louder would have fit the moment better, because the outcome here was not destruction. It was control. That morning, three Russian submarines closed in on a U.S. aircraft carrier. None reached a usable attack position. All three were detected.